Welcome to Film and Page. I'm Dominic, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the book Pet Semetary, originally published in November of 1983 and written by Stephen King. First edition page length, 373 pages. The one I'll be showing in this video is the Gallery Books trade paperback edition, published in February of 2019, with a page count of about 395 pages. That place. All at once it gets a hold of you, and you make up the sweetest smelling reasons in the world. But I could have been wrong, Lewis. That's all I'm saying. Lester could have been wrong. Stanny B could have been wrong. Hell, I ain't God either. But bringing the dead back to life? That's about as close to playing God as you can get, ain't it? Lewis opened his mouth again, then closed it again. What would have come out would have sounded wrong. Wrong and cruel. Judd, I didn't go through all that just to kill the damn cat again. Judd drained his beer and then put it carefully aside with the other empties. I guess that's it, he said. I'm all talked out. Can I ask you one other question? Lewis asked. I guess so, Judd said. Lewis said, has anyone ever buried a person up there? Judd's arm jerked convulsively. Two of the beer bottles fell off the table, and one of them shattered. Christ on his throne, he said to Lewis. No? And whoever would? You don't even want to talk about such things, Lewis. I was just curious, Lewis said, uneasily. So this is a version of Stephen King's Pet Semetary that I picked up. The cover's actually not bad for one that's just, I guess, an image from the newest film, now a major motion picture. But I really wish I could have gotten like this size, this format of book, but with the old painted cover from 1980s. But still, this isn't a bad looking book. There's the spine. Sometimes dead is better. And actually, this version, it's comfortable to read. Like, it's actually opens up nice, and it's got half decent print size and stuff. So it was pretty comfortable to hold and to read. I like this size of book. Now, before I get into my actual review of the book, I'll just give a quick rundown of the plot. Now, I'm not going to have too many spoilers in this review, but I'm going to talk about some details of the book, so there is going to be some mild spoilers, at least for this book. So spoiler warning right now. The story revolves around Dr. Lewis Creed and his family, which consists of his wife Rachel and two children, Ellie and Gage. The Creed family have just moved to a small town of Ludlow after Lewis accepts a position as the director of the University of Maine's Campus Health Service. Upon the first day at their new home, the Creed family runs into trouble as Ellie hurts her knee and Gage is stung by a bee. They are helped by their neighbor, who lives across the street, an older man named Judd. He warns Lewis about the highway that runs past their house, as the highway has frequent speeding transport trucks. Judd takes the family on a tour in the woods behind the Creed home, which is the location of the Pet Semetary, where over the decades the locals have been burying their deceased pets. At the back of the Pet Semetary is a pile of dead fallen trees called a deadfall. During the first week of university classes, a student known as Victor Pascal is horribly injured in an automobile accident, dies in Lewis's care. That night, Lewis has what he thinks a very vivid dream, where the ghost of Victor Pascal leads him to the deadfall at the back of the Pet Semetary, warning him he must never go beyond there. However, Pascal's warning is ignored when around Thanksgiving, as the family is out of town and Lewis is home by himself, Ellie's cat, Church, is killed by one of the large trucks on the road that passes their home. Lewis doesn't know how he will break the news to his daughter. Judd, feeling sympathetic, leads Lewis to the Pet Semetary with the dead body of Church, but leads him beyond the deadfall to an ancient burial ground once used by the Micmac tribe. It is there, with instructions from Judd, that Lewis buries Church. The next day, Lewis is astonished and horrified, barely able to believe what he sees as it contradicts his rational mind. Church has returned and is alive, although not the same. Church is twisted and sinister somehow, and this is only the beginning of the nightmare that is yet to come. So before I get into things that I liked and didn't like about this book, I'm going to talk a bit about my background with the story of Pet Semetary and Stephen King as an author. So Pet Semetary is a story that I'm very familiar with, and as far as Stephen King stories go, the ones that are most well known to me are this one and It. The movie I've seen quite a few times. I really like the 80s adaptation of Pet Semetary. It scared the crap out of me as a kid, and it's one that I always rewatch every few years. And then I rewatched, or I guess I watched the new one, the remake that came out a few years ago, and that one I didn't like at all. And also there's the sequel that they made to Pet Semetary that's not based on anything done by Stephen King. That one I watched for the first time only a few years back, and I didn't care for that one at all. That one was pretty bad. But that first adaptation that came out in the 80s, I actually really enjoyed that one. Now, as for Stephen King, the author, there is a point in time, now I can't remember any point in my life when I didn't know who Stephen King was. He's just like, I've always known about Stephen King. And he's one of those authors, his fame is, he's just, how can I say this? He's so famous that his fame transcends what he does. What I mean by that is, if you've never read a horror book in your life and you don't even read, you ask someone who's never read, or they're not even remotely in the horror at all, they'll know who Stephen King is. They'll know he's a writer, and they know he reads horror books. Even my parents knew who he was. My parents, they weren't into horror movies, and they weren't into science fiction, anything like that. They used to watch like westerns, Little House on the Prairie, Hee Haw, the Tommy Hunter Show, all that. That was their stuff. But if you ask them who's Stephen King, they'll say, well, he's the guy that writes scary books. Like they knew who he was. It's kind of like Wayne Gretzky. If you know nothing about hockey and you've never watched a hockey game in your life, most people will know who Wayne Gretzky is. It's just they become so famous for what they do. It transcends what they do, I guess. Now, because he was so famous and because everyone reads him, that actually is why I avoided him for years and years and years. Just because I just felt he was almost overhyped or something, or talked about too much, that I kind of wanted to find my own guy. When I first started getting into horror books, I just didn't want to jump right into Stephen King. I said, well, that's the guy that everyone, he's the go-to guy. That's the one everyone reads. I kind of want to find my own guy. And that's how I got into Bentley Little, I got into him through the Science Fiction Book Club. And that was the first time I really got into reading horror, was through Bentley Little. And I've read quite a few Bentley Little books over the years. And now the other reason why I avoided Stephen King for so long is because, and this is something that the bookstores, at least in my area, does anyway, and it really annoys me, is when you go to the horror section, it's almost all Stephen King. And whatever bit of space is left is sucked up by Dean Koontz. So there's very little room for anyone else in there, so it gets annoying. You go to the horror section, you want to pick out a horror book, and it's just all Stephen King, all Stephen King, all Stephen King. So that kind of turned me off too, and kind of annoyed me, to the point where I'll say to my girlfriend when we're in the bookstore, I'll say, well, instead of telling her I'll be in the horror section, I just tell her, well, I'm going to go in the Stephen King section. Look for me in there. But what kind of got me to change my mind and take a dip into reading Stephen King was there was a YouTube channel called Mike's Book Reviews, and he reviews a lot of science fiction, fantasy books, horror books, and I started following him on YouTube and watching his videos and stuff. And he talks about Stephen King a lot, and he's really into Stephen King, and he's really passionate about it, to the point where it's almost kind of infectious. So he really sold me on Stephen King, and I decided, okay, you know what, I'm going to try a Stephen King book. So I decided to pick one that was a reasonable page length. because that's kind of a turn off for a lot of people too, is the length of some of his books. So I decided, okay, I'll pick one that's like around 400 pages. That's like average book length, in my opinion anyway. And then I wanted to read one that I was kind of familiar with and that I already found interesting. So the story of Pet Semetary, just from at least that first movie, I always thought was a very fascinating, interesting story. So that's the one I went with. And so as for me thinking that Stephen King was overhyped or anything like that, when I read this book, and I didn't think I would be really into this book where I was already kind of familiar with the story because of the movie, I have to say, this book was awesome. And Stephen King totally, just from this book alone, he totally lives up to the hype. This was an absolute page turner. I could not put this book down. It was amazing. I just kept going and going. I read it relatively fast because it was so good. I couldn't put it down. So I want to talk about some of the things I liked about this book and some of the things I didn't like. So right off the bat, I like the whole theme of the book of how people deal with death. So that's a big theme in the book. And you kind of have two contrasts going there against each other. So you had Judd, who believes you have to deal with death, and death is like a real thing. Because everyone's going to die, you have to deal with it. And then you have Rachel, Lewis's wife, who doesn't want anything to do with death, who just doesn't even want to think about it, won't even go to funerals, can't deal with it, just totally avoids the subject. And this is kind of highlighted with the trip, the first trip they take to the Pet Semetary, where, you know, Judd is showing them around the Pet Semetary and all that, and kind of explains to Ellie, well, this is where people bury their pets so they can remember them and things like that, where Rachel finds the whole thing absolutely horrifying. And this actually causes a fight between her and her husband later on, because she feels like Ellie shouldn't have to deal with this. But his argument was she's going to have to deal with death at some point, because death can come at any time. So that's a huge theme in the book. And I really enjoyed it, how people react to death and how they deal with death. And that informs a lot of the actions of the characters in the book. Now, the other thing I liked about it was the horror aspect wasn't over the top. So I'm used to reading Bentley Little, and a lot of his stuff is like really over the top horror. So it's almost like to the point where it's comic bookish, but that's also what makes his books fun. Like Bentley Little's books almost never fail to entertain me, but it's a lot more over the top than at least this book was anyway. Now, I don't know about other Stephen King books, but just this one alone, the Bentley Little books, the horror is much more over the top, to the point where they're like black comedies almost, because if you read the story, it's obvious he's making fun of Walmart, or the policy, it's obviously he's making fun of the insurance company through his horror stories. Where this, it was very subtle. It was a very subtle build-up throughout the book. It wasn't very obvious, which almost made it more spooky, more ominous. And it's like a constant tension building throughout the book. The tension's constantly piling up in this book as it slowly, story slowly, rolls on. The tension builds up, so it just makes you want to read it more. Like I couldn't put the thing down. And then the other thing I really liked is this book kind of enhanced the movie a lot more. And I was actually surprised how close of an adaptation that 80s film is to the book. Now with the new one, they went right off the rails. And that's probably why I didn't like it, even though I wasn't familiar with the actual source material, just the 80s film. But the book kind of enhanced the 80s film because it filled in some blanks that the film kind of left out. One thing that always annoyed me about the 80s film is you had a feud between Louis Creed and Rachel's father. And in the movie, it's not explained at all. You don't know why they hate each other. But in the book, they explain that. The feud is basically that, Rachel's father always looked down on Louis and thought he was like too low class to be with his daughter, wanted her to be with somebody else. And then now, spoiler warning, there's a point in the book where he tries to pay Louis off. He tells him, I'll pay, here's a check, this will pay for your medical schooling if you just get out of my daughter's life. And of course, Louis, they have a big blow up and Louis tells him to take his money and stuff it. And that's how their feud got going. That's what started. So that now it makes sense whenever I go back and rewatch the film. That will make a lot more sense now. Something else that's not really touched upon too much in the movie is all the lore behind the Pet Semetary, or the ancient burial ground, the Micmac burial ground. That goes into a lot of detail. Judd spends a lot of time explaining to Lewis the history of the Micmacs and how the cemetery got cursed in the first place. And when people come back, when you bury someone and they come back, that person that you buried, it's not the same person that comes back anymore. It's now like almost like a demonic force has control of their body, and it's like the Wendigo. So the Wendigo, legend of the Wendigo is tied in there, which that's not touched upon in the film at all, and it made for like a really, really fascinating read. So if you want to read a really good book, and if you haven't read Stephen King before, this is like an absolute must read. And as for things I didn't like a book, honestly, I can't think of anything. Like, I love the book that much. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head that I didn't like about this book. I kept going through it. It was entertaining. And it's been a while since I read a book that really grabbed a hold of me, that I couldn't stop. Like, it was just an absolute page turner. Maybe the last book before this one was The Three-Body Problem. That really grabbed hold of me and I couldn't stop reading it. But this was another book that did that to me. So if you haven't read Stephen King before and you want to try him out, I would start with this book. That would be my recommendation. One, it's average page in length, and it's a very good story, and a lot of people will attest to that, and it's one of his scariest books that a lot of people also say that about the book as well. Even Stephen King himself said that this is the scariest book he's ever written. Now, if you're a real horror fan and you read a lot of horror books, chances are you probably already have read this book. But if you haven't read any, I would definitely start with this one. It is an awesome, awesome book. And now after reading it, I kind of regret not trying out Stephen King years ago. But I'm glad I corrected that mistake with this book, and I'm going to try out some more of his stuff down the road. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I will see you at the next one. I'd like to say thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all in helping this channel grow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded.